Next one we have is a science question. It says, why do we only see in a small spectrum? What is the easiest color on the eye? Yesterday, you used a green laser for the bacteria viewing. Why green? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple questions in there. I'm going to pause just briefly on this, just jump back for a second to the question I talked about a minute ago. It turns out that iambic pentameter, the development of it is Latin poetry, tended to have 10 syllables, and that ends up entering French and Italian poetry by way of the fact that French and Italian, those languages evolved from Latin. And then Geoffrey Chaucer actually was studying Italian poets, and he was the one who started using 10-syllable iambic pentameter basically as a way to anglicize what he was seeing the Italian poets doing. So taking their style and just adopting it to English. So anyways, that's the invention of iambic pentameter.
Oh, I was actually wondering how. I was like,
how this connected? Were you not sure? You just
Like,
didn't remember that.
I
That was
was-
my last question.
Hang on, what?
That was the,
What was I supposed to say?
anyway, so that was the other question. The question I'm currently going to answer is, it says, so why do we only see in a small spectrum? What is the easiest color on the eye? And yesterday you used the green laser for the bacteria viewing. Why green? Okay, so let's talk about how our eyes work, I guess, and then I'll try to tackle these questions based on what. So some of those are a little bit tricky, but I can definitely tell us why we see and how we see, and then I can make a best guess at some of those. Okay, so light, what we think of as light, and what we think of as visible light, the things that we see in color, and everything that I perceive as vision, is all a set of light waves of a certain wavelength on a much larger spectrum of energy rays, and that spectrum is referred to as the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the idea is that any form of energy, essentially, that's given off from something, any form of energy that sort of radiates out from something, anything that we perceive of as heat or magnetism, these things ultimately fall somewhere on this electromagnetic spectrum. So if we could jump to my screen really quickly, things like radio waves, the way that we transmit, obviously, signals throughout the radio, or microwaves, infrared waves, which are really, we think of as heat waves typically, ultraviolet rays, X-rays, gamma rays, maybe you've heard of some of these, all of these things, and visible light, these are all part of what we refer to as the electromagnetic spectrum. And the only difference between something like radio waves, microwaves, the light that I can see right now, and X-rays, the only difference between those things is ultimately the wavelength of those waves and the intensity of them. So this diagram right here on the screen shows pretty clearly that we have on the left side of the electromagnetic spectrum, on the low energy side of the electromagnetic spectrum, we have things like radio waves and microwaves. These are waves that have really long wavelengths, and for that reason they have low frequencies. I won't go too deep into this, but the basic concept is that the longer the wavelength of a wave, the lower its frequency, because all of these waves ultimately travel at the same speed, but the longer wavelength means that even though the longer wavelength is traveling at the same speed as a shorter wavelength, it will take a longer time for a full wavelength, for a full cycle of that wave to pass a given point. So it's considered to have lower frequency. As we get up and look at X-rays and gamma rays, X-rays just like the kinds of things that a doctor would use to be able to see inside your body and look at your bones, maybe if you fractured something. These kind of waves have short wavelengths, and they're therefore said to have a high frequency. And then you can see in the middle there, right in the middle of the spectrum, is visible light. And so this might be a little bit of a hint as to why we see the visible spectrum that we do. Let me show another graphic here. This is another graphic that shows the electromagnetic spectrum and just gives a little bit of additional information there. So you can see again this idea of a wave with a wavelength that shortens as we go up from radio waves to gamma rays. Right in the middle, we've got the visible spectrum of light, and you can see that the order of the light colors, the order of the colors that we see, are in the same order as we describe them when we describe the color order in the rainbow. So Roijabiv, or red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, and violet. So the lowest frequency light or color that we can see is red light. And the highest frequency color that we can see is violet light. And that's the shortest wavelength also. And that's why we talk about wavelengths that are longer than the red spectrum that we can see. We talk about those as infrared. In other words, lower than red. We don't know what those colors look like, right? Like if you could continue to see along the electromagnetic spectrum, maybe there are other colors. If we could perceive below red, maybe infrared colors have a totally different color that I can't even conceive of. Or maybe if you get to electromagnetic waves that are of a shorter wavelength than violet color, maybe that's a whole new color that I can't even perceive of, as I said. There's a really awesome comic. I think I've used this before on the show, but there's a really great web comic called The Oatmeal, and there's a particular comic that this guy put out about the mantis shrimp, and in that he talks a little bit about the idea of different animals and how they see. And I just want to show a section from that. So he talks about the idea that dogs have two, in their eyes, they have two color receptive cones. So inside of your eyes, you have color receptive cones, and each of those cones is responsible for picking up a certain wavelength of light. And the more cones you have, the more that those cones can work together to see additional wavelengths of light. So you can see, he indicates here that dogs can see green and blue and a little bit of yellow. In other words, the spectrum of light between green and blue. And then humans add this red cone, and that gives us the ability to see all kinds of additional colors, every other color derived from red, and every mix that you can make with red and blue or red and green light. But if you think about other animals, there are other animals out there that are capable of seeing light that we're not capable of seeing. So like butterflies have 5 color receptive cones. They're able to see 2 colors or 2 frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum that human beings are not. And so this guy who drew the comic, he just put those as question marks because we're not even able to conceive of what those colors might look like or how those colors might mix with the colors that we can see. And so I guess I'll try to jump back to the question there. The question asks, why do we see the frequencies that we see? Why do we see the visible spectrum of light? And the reason would have to be that the visible spectrum of light, the light that we see, is most convenient, most useful for us as a species to see. We evolved to see the visible spectrum of light because it helps us in our living in order to be successful living organisms. Along with that, we know that the visible spectrum of light is one of the areas of the electromagnetic spectrum that easily penetrates the atmosphere when it comes down from the sun. Many of the sun's rays, many of the sun's lower frequency electromagnetic rays and its higher frequency electromagnetic rays are actually blocked by Earth's atmosphere. And so it may be that as humans were evolving, or as the biological eye that was evolving that eventually evolved into the human eye, as that was developing, it was developing to pick up just the most common types of light that were being reflected in the environment that they lived in. And that's me speculating a little bit. I don't fully know. But I think it should be pointed out that other animals like butterflies, dogs, and very many different kinds of animals, I actually found a list here. Spiders are able to see green light, but then also ultraviolet light, and that's different than what humans see. Or like birds here are able to see anywhere from 5 to 7 different colors, colors that humans are not able to see. But different animals have different experiences in terms of what they're able to see along the electromagnetic spectrum. And so while I can't speak to exactly why we see the spectrum that we do versus birds see the spectrum that they do, it would be an educated guess to say that they must see, or I could assume that they must see the spectrum that they see because that's the spectrum that's most valuable to them as a species. If you're a spider, there must be some important information that you get from ultraviolet light, although I can't speculate as to what that is at the moment. But again, and then I think there was another part of the question that asked about why I used green in the science experiment yesterday. I just used green because green laser pointers are more powerful laser pointers typically than red laser pointers. We could have used a red laser pointer and gotten a similar result, but it wouldn't have projected as clearly. If I had a more powerful red laser pointer, we definitely could have used that. Okay, that was all over the place.
I really want to perceive. I want to know what those
Perceive.
colors are.
Yeah, the color blurple. If only we
That's
could
a
see
great
it.
color.
I want to know.
There's a really great set of books called the Discworld Series, and in that series there's like this color that only certain people can see, and it's awesome. It's like regularly referred to. It has a great name to
What
it.
do
I
they
can't think of
call
what it
it?
is.
It's an awesome color, or it's awesome that only some people can see it?
It's well, I guess it's just awesome that some people can see it. I guess it's just a color.
I was going to say, how do you know it's awesome?
It's awesome compared. Well, the descriptions of
'Cause
it
you're
in
one of those
in this
special people.
fiction fantasy book sounds awesome.
Oh, okay. Because if I was the only one that could see a color, I would just tell everybody how awesome it is,
Yeah.
just so
I
they
would
were
too.
jealous.
That's true.
Even
I
if it was
really want
just
to know what it is.
different shade of gray.
I'm gonna look up what it's called.
Yeah. We'll just never know.